is from Newfound Hero. Thank you, Bat or Rob, for introducing me to my new hero, Marley Diaz, who is 14. She said, dressing in an androgynous way, mixing up the masculine and feminine, blurring those boundaries. I'm cool with that. No one should ever be limited by stereotypes of gender, just as no one should ever be limited by stereotypes of race.
To share their talk with us.
There we go. Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you all for having me here. My name is Acorn or Mary. I use they, them pronouns. So an example of that is if you were talking about me and you were going to say, wow, she's so cool. Instead, you would just say, wow, they're so cool. So that's how that works.
You're so cool.
Thank you. The original example I was going to give is like something like, she goes to the store, or they go to the store, and then I was like, come on. So, I am so excited to be here to talk about gender with you all this morning. This is just such an amazing experience for me. Let's give it up for these decorations, right? When I walked in last Sunday and saw these flags, I saw my people being represented in a church space. That was such an incredible, heartwarming, cool experience. So thank you. This is beautiful. I love it. So go ahead and get into it. Yay, it's working. Just to be clear, I'm not like a gender expert or whatever you might call it. This is just something I'm really passionate about. I think gender is really fascinating. As a culture, we pretend to know a lot about it, but even if you dig just a little bit under the surface, you realize that we've kind of missed the mark several times. So a few years ago, after working in education for a bit, I became frustrated with just seeing how educators and parents and our general culture perpetuates gender stereotypes and gender binary and gender roles. So I had an idea. Instead of ranting on Facebook about it, okay, in addition to ranting on Facebook about it, I decided to develop just a presentation to share this passion with others and to empower them with some knowledge that's empowered me and helped me. So this is something that I'm learning and growing with and evolving with, and I'm on a journey just like you all. It's amazing the things that I've learned and the ways that I've changed and the ways this presentation has changed. So basically, we can do better for everyone. We can make space for everyone. We can make everyone feel welcome and feel like they have the right and the safety to be themselves, whoever that may be. So starting off, this is the genderbread person. Now, I always hesitate a little bit to use this. It's a little bit complicated and problematic. The reason I hesitate is this graphic was originally made by some queer and trans activists who posted it on Tumblr. And then the owner of the website, in the top corner there, is pronounced metrosexual, is a cisgender heterosexual man. He saw this graphic, and he kind of ran with it and copyrighted it, and then did not give original credit to the 4 people who I made sure to list on the bottom here. Now, it's a bummer, but it's also a great story of how allyship can go wrong. His heart is in such a good place. His website is amazing. It shares so many resources, and a lot of it is free, and a lot of people are learning from that. But he made one misstep, which is he didn't credit and raise up the queer and trans activists that created this. So with that being said, I'm still going to use it. So let's get into it. We have, in the brain here, we have gender identity. So the way that people explain gender identity is what's in their head, how they know who they are, their gender or their lack of gender, how they just see themselves. Gender expression is on the outside, so that's how you present yourself. And traditionally, we've thought of that as more feminine or masculine. And we have, on each of these, you can see there's like a little bar. And the cool thing is you look at that and you're like, oh, I can move mine to right here. That's where I am. And then also right here, wherever you want. Or you can just blow it all up. Forget about the spectrum. Go outside that and be who you are, right? This is just a way that humans can kind of make a lot of information a little more simple and easier to understand. Now, moving on with biological sex. So when I studied sociology, the way that they talked about gender versus sex was gender is a social construct and sex is a biological fact or reality. And luckily, that has even evolved. Because if you think about it, sure, gender is a social construct, but so is biology, right? So if you think of the ways that we categorize things as far as biological sex, and when we talk about that, we mean genitalia, hormones, chromosomes. The way that we have done that has been with a bias that we have not really shed light on until recently. Now the next part is attraction. So you can be attracted to more of masculinity, more femininity, and in between, neither, both, all of it, or not at all. There are people that identify as asexual or aromantic in the world as well. Has anybody seen this before? I always like to ask that. Okay. Yeah, cool. I always end up putting it in the presentation because it's a wonderful jumping off point to talk about gender. Now this is something that I looked up recently. This is the trans umbrella, gender nonconforming umbrella. This is a really exciting time to be talking about gender. There are so many different perspectives. There are so many different ways of looking at it, and sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. In fact, when I searched for this graphic, I was like, which one is the right one? There are so many different things. I saw somewhere the gender nonconforming was put under the transgender umbrella, and some people kept it separate. I looked up the person who did this. If you look in the corner, it's Booker Murray, who is a trans man. So I wanted to make sure that this was coming from a queer trans person. And I think he did a really great job with it. So when you look at this, it's a lot of words, right? There's a lot going on, a lot of different identities. You might see the word transgender shortened to trans, or even trans with an asterisk. And basically what that means is that is an umbrella term that holds space for all of these identities, all of these people. And I'm not one to say if somebody doesn't feel like they fit under that umbrella, I'm not going to force them under that. However they identify, however their gender expression is played out, however they explain their gender identity, I respect that. Now, in the description, I mentioned that gender is complicated, right? And a lot of times with everything going on in today's world, we hear a lot of people who are like, when did it become so complicated? And it always has been, right? I had a weird analogy this morning. It's a chemistry analogy, which I was like, okay, I guess I'll go with that. I got a D in chemistry, so take that with a grain of salt. But the way I think of it is this is kind of like the periodic table, right? It's not like the elements didn't exist before the periodic table. We just didn't have the words or the categorization of them. So feel free, when you go home, if you're wanting to learn more about this, just Google trans umbrella because you'll see so many different versions of this. But what I like about this one is, for transgender, it says, encompasses any individual whose gender identity doesn't match with their gender assigned at birth, right? And then gender nonconforming encompasses any individual who crosses over or challenges their society's traditional gender roles and or expressions. And then we have lots of different words under here. Non-binary. Has anybody heard of non-binary? Agender, genderqueer, polygender, transsexual, transgender, and then androgynous, gender creative, I think is a cool one, gender diverse. Lots of great different words. Now the good news is, unlike the periodic table, you don't have to memorize this. Right? Because everyone's journey, everyone's relationship with gender is different. And it's an individual experience. It can be shared with others as well in some aspects, but there's a lot of things that are individual. An example of that is my partner and I are both genderqueer. So that shows up differently for them than it shows up for me. For me, being labeled as a girl or a woman has never been something that is hurtful to me. It's always just kind of felt like it's come from outside of me. It's never felt empowering like it's come from within me until I started kind of thinking about gender more in my journey. For my partner, girl or woman is not a label that they feel comfortable with. And they kind of explain their gender as how I talked about earlier, like there is a spectrum, but they explain that their gender is kind of outside of the spectrum, just floating around, and it's really cool. When they were talking about that, I was like, oh yeah, wow, you know? All right. So talking more about that, this idea that gender is kind of an individual experience, this popped up on my Facebook a couple days ago, and I was like, oh, yes! I'm going to put it in there. So it says it's explaining non-binary, but this could be explaining lots of different gender identities. So we have gender offering two hats. Which one of these two do you want? And the person is like, I'll be right back. And then they come back with their own like gender hat. I love it. It's all rainbow and sparkly, and look how happy they are. Isn't that amazing? And then apparently the punchline of all these comics is, oh no. So I got into a little bit of a rabbit hole with that. There's some really cute ones on there, so you should check it out too. Now, just a few more terms that I want to make sure we cover. Cisgender. Raise your hand if you've heard the term cisgender. Oh, cool. So you all are familiar with that. It's just great that that word has kind of taken hold and people are using it more, because the idea behind it is if we have people who are transgender, then we have people that are cisgender. We have people in between, non-binary, all sorts, right? Everyone has a gender or a gender identity, or their gender identity is a gender, lack of gender, right? So there is no default human experience. So that's why cisgender is being used more often these days. It has been around for a while. Intersex, I wanted to mention that. That was actually under the transgender umbrella here. But I do want to make sure that some people know some intersex people identify as transgender, some do not. So it's, again, that individual journey with gender. Raise your hand if you've heard the term intersex. Gosh, this audience rules. So basically, people that are born with chromosomes, hormones, genitalia that don't line up with our society's ideas of what male or female are. And I wanted to mention this because the intersex community is rising up on their own, and they are fighting against these surgeries that we've been doing on infants. Basically, we have been, for centuries, if someone is born intersex, then we've thought, oh, well, we got to decide, and we put them in a different category, right? And perform surgeries on their genitalia. And there have been some complications for some of those people later in life, as far as infections and trouble urinating and all sorts of things. So this community has been left out by the LGBTQ plus community at times. So I just want to make sure that I mention them on their own as well. Intersectionality. Have you all heard of intersectionality? Yeah, great term, right? Whenever we talk about gender, I always just want to mention it and make sure we talk about how racism, classism, ableism, all of these things are going to intersect with gender and have a different experience for someone, maybe than me, right? And then microaggressions. So comments or actions that kind of, it's a whoopsie, right? It's not intended to hurt, but saying things like, oh wow, you really pass as a boy, or you really pass as a girl. Not all transgender people want to pass, and not all transgender people want to have their identity brought up to them and talked about. Or another example of that is like, you throw well for a girl, right? It's like a kind of a compliment, but not. Now, whenever we talk about sex or gender, there's always the nature versus nurture debate, which is interesting to me because that's another binary, right? Yeah, it's another binary. And if you scratch just under the surface a little bit, you find that the science doesn't really back it up. There are some studies that are saying, yes, there are differences between the brains, and then there are some that are saying, no, not really. So ultimately, what I like, Julia Serrano is a great writer. She's a trans woman who wrote Whipping Girl. And she just talks about how it's socialization with nature, right? With biology and traits that already exist that we are highlighting and exaggerating as a way to keep people in different categories. And of course, there's always going to be an exception. I love that. Nature has always humiliated the self-congratulatory scientist. Right? There's so many examples in nature. Seahorses, who gives birth? Yeah. Lions, who does the hunting? The females, right? There actually been, there's been records of homosexual animals, of transgender animals, really cool stuff. Has anybody heard about the penguins at the zoo? The two daddy penguins that were given an egg, and now there's a book about it. It's so precious. I love it. I think it's and Tango Makes Three. Yeah. Yeah. Check out that book. It'll make you cry. So, how have we been erasing this throughout history? The short answer: colonization, colonialism. A lot of cultures have recognized non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, trans people, and they've actually upheld them. In some Native American traditions, there is the Two-Spirit tradition. Has anyone heard of the Two-Spirit identity? Perfect. So the Two-Spirit people are actually revered and seen and held up. Did child rearing. People would come to them for knowledge, for advice. And there's also been some cultures like India, Polynesia, Thailand, New Zealand. They've also had some traditions that honor gender non-conforming people. Oh, I forgot to mention that. And then Magnus Hirschfeld, really cool. He was working with trans and queer folk, and he was studying surgeries and hormones and chromosomes and all of these things, and his entire library and all his research was burned by Nazis. So yeah, that's something that I learned about really recently, really devastating and fascinating that we like we said, gender's always been complicated. It's always been there. So basically, we're being duped a little bit. I listened to a podcast on the way here. I was so thrilled. It's a podcast called Every Little Thing, and they were talking about the whole pink and blue thing. And I was listening on the way, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so perfect. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So pink and blue weren't always gendered colors. And it's here in the United States that we decided they would be gendered colors, and then kind of forced that upon other people. In the podcast, it said that it was actually in the 20s that the country was undecided. In some regions, if you go to a department store, pink was for boys, blue was for girls, and then other regions it was flipped. And there were advice columnists, and one of them was which one is it? Is pink for boys or girls? I can't tell, I don't know. And the advice columnist was just I don't know either. So then by the 50s, there was a consensus that pink is for girls, blue is for boys. And then by the 80s, that was really set in stone because companies started seeing a way to make a profit, right? If you have a little girl and she has all these pink things, you can't pass those pink things down to a little boy in our culture. So that's called the pink factor, something that was written about by Peggy Orenstein. She has a great book called Cinderella Ate My Daughter. It's a really, really great read talking about gender. So not only did we not have pink and blue as really gendered colors, but up until the age of 6 or 7, little kids dressed the same. They were put in dresses, And maybe some of you all have seen this picture before. Yeah, some of you have. So does anyone know who this is? This is FDR. Yeah, you?
I've seen things like that before.
But yeah, so cool. In the podcast, they made a joke that was like, hey, you got it wrong. Dress for success. If you want your kids to be president, put them in a dress. That's how we get it going, right? So it's so interesting, too, because although we did have non-gendered clothing and toys and ideas of babies, it's not necessarily because we were more progressive then. It was because of a different way that we looked at child development. But what I find interesting is, in today's time, would we say that a dress is gender neutral?
No.
Right? No. We have this idea that gender neutral means masculine. Right? So I just think it's really interesting that this was considered gender neutral. And that's kind of something that I'd like to get back to as a culture. It's just anything is gender neutral. Right? Painting your nails, that's gender neutral. Wearing a dress, that's gender neutral. Wearing boots, that's gender neutral. Just be you. So of course we got to end with the hope, right? And the ways to help. So use gender inclusive language. This is a tough one. People have a really hard time breaking the habit of saying you guys, right? Or you guys. So right? Yeah. I'm from the South, right? We have an advantage. I already say y'all. The South, we're more progressive than you think. You know? We got y'all. Messed up with the bathroom bills, but we got y'all. Okay? So avoid saying that or gender terms like ladies and gentlemen. Instead, you could say, folks, everyone, I was in distinguished guests. Right? Ooh. That's nice. I like that. I feel like a
Low
distinct.
lives.
Oh, low lives. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, supposedly now, if you send a cover letter, in the old days you're supposed to say dear sir or madam.
Right.
And now, really, the thing is you should just put RE:, the job title and start.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's good to know.
You can put it dear sir or madam.
Yeah.
Or just remember this thing.
Yeah, it's remember being concerned. Yeah.
I had a friend who worked at the CIA, and he got around it by saying greetings.
Greetings.
So I do
Greetings
that.
and salutations.
It works.
Greetings and salutations. Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's lots of different ways to get around it. And that's exactly what this is. It's just, this journey is just kind of retraining your brain from what we've been taught, what's been put into it over time. Also, using the singular they to refer to people. This is something, even though I've been using they, them pronouns, I still mess up. We all mess up, right? And if you do mess up, well, I guess that's the next part that we're talking more about pronouns, but using singular they, when you just see like a stranger walking on the street and you're going to talk about them nicely, you can just say, wow, that person, or they. You know, it's a way of just retraining your brain, because we have this idea that a gendered expression on the outside always matches the gender identity in the head, and that's not always true. So we can't make assumptions about that. And as far as pronouns, just respect and use other people's pronouns. And that can be hard at first. They, them is, right? And culturally it has been not singular all the time. But what I found is that at first it was a little bit clunky for me, and it was a little bit hard. But now I've found that I actually communicate more clearly, because I'm thinking more about how am I going to make sure that I am communicating this and they still know who the they pronoun is referring to. And it becomes a lot easier. Another thing is you can present your own pronouns on your name tags. I noticed you all have your awesome name tags. You can add your pronouns to those. In an email, you can sign off with your pronouns at the bottom. My sister has actually done that before. I have. I need to get on that. Educate yourself and others. This knowledge that we've been sharing this morning, share it. Share it to other people. Let them know about it. The pink and blue thing, it's like you you have somebody that is like dead set on gender stereotypes and gender roles, and this is the way it's been and it's always been, right? The fact that pink and blue is something that happened less than 100 years ago, and it's like, so it's just planting that seed. There are some great organizations like Everyday Feminism, Trans Equality, and Gender Spectrum. They all have amazing resources, a lot of them for free. And then also, just respecting privacy of others, avoiding questions about birth names, hormone surgeries. If they want to share that information, if they feel safe enough, if they trust you, then they will share it. And then do not out someone without their permission, which I think we probably already knew that, right? But it doesn't hurt to say it. And I meant to say on here too, another thing is be kind to yourself. Just like me, this is a journey. I am still learning. I'm still evolving. And maybe something that I thought about, a certain way that I thought about gender last week, I gained new information this week, and I'm like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And just evolving with it. And then, of course, keeping UUs, because they walk the walk. That offering, I was like, oh, man, that's so cool. Growing up Catholic, I was like, where does this money go? Okay. All right, well, does anyone have any questions or comments? Yeah.
I think I look really cool in my gray suit and a pink shirt.
I think so too.
But I bet you'd rather have this one, right?
Oh, I like that too.
I agree. I haven't seen it, but I agree. I'm picturing it.
Pink and gray are so.
It's a good combo. It is a good combo. Yeah.
I had the privilege this year of observing a journey on Facebook. I belong to a large congregation in Virginia, and I got to know a lot of people. And sang with a woman who came with a little girl, and she was pregnant, and then she had the second little girl. His name was Tessa. And I've been on 4 years now. I've been here. So earlier this year, she posted and said that Tessa, who was 11 at the time, wanted to use they, their pronouns. She cut her hair off. That was fine. So some time went on, and then she said that Tessa considered herself to be non-binary, and the school was not as supportive. The school was supportive. The kids weren't as supportive as they might have been. So she was known as TJ. Now, just recently, Liz came on and said, I know I refer to my kids by initials, but she said, I have to show you this. It was a new birth certificate that said Thomas Oliver. And he is now 12, fully identifies as a boy. Mm-hmm. Parents divorced, father's on board, mother's getting remarried soon. He's on board. His whole family is on board. And this week they went to Social Security and got the Social Security card changed.
That's
So
awesome.
it's just amazing.
Yeah.
And if more parents could do this,
Mm-hmm.
there would be fewer suicides and unhappy children.
Yes.
And I just have so much respect for this family to be so open about it and to share what they're going through. I mean, think of the journey.
That's amazing. And I love too that that's something I wanted to hit on, but there's only so many slides I can put in. But this idea, a lot of parents have this anxiety of what if it's a phase? What if it's a phase? Honestly, your kid experimenting and getting to know themselves is a lot cooler than some of the phases I went through. Okay, there was a phase where I only listened to 1950s music for about 2.5 years. Okay, to the point where in 8th grade, somebody said something about Britney Spears, and I didn't know who Britney Spears was. So there are worse phases that your kid can go through, right? Were there any other questions? Yeah.
I have trouble with the they, them, with allowing myself to say it because I was, it was corrected as, plural.
Right.
And it's just, I'm on board with it intellectually, but it's just hard to say it naturally.
Right.
And I don't think I'm alone on that one.
I don't think so, and I think that it's important that we have this conversation.
Yeah.
When I first started referring to myself as they, them, or referring to others as they, them, I often kind of felt like I was like emphasizing they, you know, I was like very like self-conscious about it.
Right.
But it's with practice, it becomes more natural, and it becomes, there's more of a flow to it.
And that little thing you said about being kind to yourself, that's huge because, you know, I screw up so often and I say stupid things. And if I just stayed down on myself, I just never want to get out of bed in the morning, right?
Right, exactly.
So-
Yeah. And we need you out of bed. Time to go fight.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Matthew and I are getting ready to go to Europe, and so we're filling out lots of forms and doing all this stuff, and airlines and this, and so we filled out some forms. And it'll say gender, and it'll say male, female, and then now there's an other. And you press on the button, and you can choose for some of these things. And I'm like, holy balls, the government is actually getting on board with this, you know? Like, wow, I never thought I still say I never thought I'd see an African American in the White House, but I never thought I'd see that because
Right.
someone somewhere is saying we need this in this form.
Yeah.
And I was like, yay, America, you know,
Yeah.
we're still doing some things right.
Yeah.
And then the next step is not having male, female, other, but just gender.
Yes.
Insert your own.
Yeah.
But to click on that drop-down menu and see something,
leave it off.
I understand in terms of like when you're going through TSA, they want to say this is what we're looking for, but yeah, I mean, there's no reason to have it, but I mean, I was just like floored. I said, Joe, look at this, you know? So.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thanks for including gender spectrum because I was lucky enough we had a trans kid at our elementary school and they came and did a presentation with parents and I learned so much.
Yes.
And they went around to the kids and they could do it for any age. Like, this read a story about a kid wanting to wear purple pants.
Yeah.
And it's so much easier for little kids to understand this concept. Like the parents are just like, what about this? What about this? And kids are like, oh, okay.
Yeah, the kids are like, yeah, purple pants, I can get behind that.
Yeah, I like gender words.
Yeah. Yeah, Gender Spectrum is a great resource, and they actually have a conference every summer that you can volunteer at or go to for parents, educators, medical professionals, all sorts of things.
I have a question, just because I'm not always certain of the right terms to use. So someone who was not born male and now sees himself as a man, that's the word is trans man, and the other way, if you see yourself as a woman, then it's a trans woman.
Right.
But it has nothing to do with where the starting point was.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
starting point. Okay.
Yeah, and then also there's some confusion. It's something that's always changing and evolving. It's so exciting, but we don't say like born as a man and then became a woman, things like that. You would say assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth, because that's really highlighting what we have, as a culture, have done, is we have assigned these sexes and these genders onto people. And then those can also be shortened to AMAB, assigned male at birth, and AFAB, assigned female at birth.
I've never been about that.
Right, I know. It's okay.
We better make this our last.
Okay.
We'll make this our last
I thought
one.
that like instead of using they, there's only like instead of he or she, they always use she now. That was the effort, but it's not about the like using the pronoun thing.
Right, like using he, she.
Yeah, instead of using he, she, or something, always use she for everything.
Oh.
Yeah, that freaks me out.
Yeah.
Oh, S-H-E.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that. She, yeah. I would say just they.
It's binary.
Yeah, it's binary, exactly.
That's a lot of another community that just always use he.
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 Oh. Yeah.
It sounds right. You don't.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
Fisher.
Yeah.
And you can just be confident, right?
Yeah, and then you don't have to.
What did he say?
Yeah. Should we? Do we have time?
So we can definitely continue the discussion over coffee and snacks. I hope we do. We do have one more song to sing if Dave.
Why don't we just join hands?
You want to? Yeah.
You want to do the song?
I would like to. All right.